The alarm did not stop screaming, and neither did my hands, moving faster than my mind could follow, tightening the last valve on a reactor core that had no business still holding together. Steam hissed through a cracked pipe above me. Somewhere far above the maintenance deck, the sky of Valkyrie was turning a color no sky should turn, a deep orange bruise spreading across the clouds as the planet's dying sun poured too much heat into an atmosphere that could not hold it anymore. Every ship that could leave was already leaving. I could hear them through the open hatch, the low roar of engines lifting off one after another from the capital's landing fields, carrying diplomats, engineers, and soldiers from a dozen different worlds back to safety. My own ticket was sitting in my pocket, printed that morning, boarding time still 2 hours away. I was not going to use it. 3 days earlier, none of this seemed possible. I was just another contractor from Earth, sent to Valkyrie to keep an aging reactor system running under a supply agreement between our two peoples. It was not glamorous work. I spent my days elbow-deep in coolant lines, and my evenings talking with a young woman named Ilyara Vek, who visited the maintenance bay more often than a member of the ruling family probably should have. She liked it there, she told me once, because nobody in that room needed anything from her. Everywhere else on Valkyrie she was a symbol, a piece on a board, the last heir of a fading house. In the maintenance bay she was just someone who asked good questions about how the coolant pumps worked. I liked her plainness. She liked my honesty. It became a habit, and then something closer to a friendship neither of us had really planned for. Then the readings started coming back wrong. The planet's star, already old and unstable, began losing its balance faster than any of the scientists had predicted. Within a day, every allied government with ships in orbit issued the same order. Withdraw. Do not stay. Do not risk assets on a dying world. It was called the Withdrawal Doctrine, and every species out here followed it without question. Not because they were cruel, but because they were careful. You did not waste people, ships, or resources on a fight you could not win. It was simple math, repeated so many times across so many worlds that nobody even called it cowardice anymore. They called it wisdom. Ilyara told me about it the night the evacuation order reached us, standing in the doorway of the maintenance bay with her arms folded, looking more tired than I had ever seen her. She said she had watched this happen before, on smaller scales. Allies came, allies helped, and when the numbers turned bad, allies left. She said it without anger, like she was reciting a law of nature. She expected the same thing from me. She told me to be on a transport by morning, and she said it kindly, like she was doing me a favor by not making it harder than it needed to be. I did not answer her that night. I just kept working, checking valves that did not need checking, because I already knew what I was going to do and I did not know how to say it yet. The next morning, our ambassador, a sharp, exhausted woman named Claire Whitfield, called every human contractor into a briefing room and handed out final departure assignments herself. When she reached me, she placed my ticket directly into my hand and told me my transport left in 6 hours. I looked at it for a long moment, then I set it back down on her desk. She asked me what I thought I was doing. I told her I was staying. And she reminded me, very patiently, that this was not a decision I had the authority to make, that the planet's magnetic field was failing, that radiation levels would soon make the surface unlivable, that every rational calculation said the mission here was already over. I told her I understood all of that. I told her I was staying anyway. She did not have a category for that kind of answer. Neither did I, really. I just knew that somewhere between fixing coolant lines and talking with Ilyara about pump pressure, this place had stopped being a job. Word traveled fast. By the time I made it back down to the lower levels, Thesk, a logistics officer from a neighboring alliance and one of the few people on this base who treated me like a friend rather than a project, was waiting for me with his 4 eyes doing that slow blink his people did when they were completely confused. He asked me, very seriously, if I understood that staying served no strategic purpose. He was not upset, just puzzled, the way you might be puzzled watching someone walk directly into weather everyone agreed was dangerous. I told him it was not about strategy. Where I came from, we had a habit, deep and old, of not leaving people behind, even when leaving was the smart thing to do. It was not a plan. It was closer to a reflex, something built into us long before any of us learned how to calculate odds. He said that sounded like a very expensive habit. I told him it probably was. Ilyara found me an hour later, still in the maintenance bay, running a full diagnostic on the reactor even though every other engineer on the base had already left their posts. She stood in the doorway again, except this time she did not fold her arms. She just watched me work, like she was waiting to catch me packing. When she realized I was not, she asked me directly why I was still there. I told her the same thing I told Claire and Thesk. I was staying. She said that did not make sense. She said every ally she had ever known left when the numbers turned bad, and the numbers here were worse than bad. She said she had already made peace with watching me go, and she needed me to stop confusing that peace. I told her I was not trying to confuse anything. I told her that back home, we had a saying, that you do not calculate the value of a person before deciding whether they are worth staying for. You just stay. I told her that if her people had learned only one lesson about the universe, they had learned the wrong one. That leaving was not always wisdom. Sometimes it was only fear wearing a calm voice. She did not answer right away. She just looked at the reactor readouts glowing behind me, then back at my face, like she was trying to decide if I actually believed what I was saying, or if I was only saying it because it sounded brave. I kept working through the night. The reactor was the only thing keeping emergency power flowing to the last evacuation routes still active on the surface. Corridors where civilians, not soldiers, not diplomats, just ordinary people, were still making their way to the remaining transports. If that reactor failed even for a few minutes, those corridors would go dark. And in the dark, with radiation climbing and the ground shaking from the star's growing instability, people would not make it out in time. So I stayed at that console, running repairs that no manual accounted for, holding a failing system together through sheer stubbornness and a refusal to let it die on my watch. Ilyara stayed too. She did not have the training to fix machines, but she had authority, and she used it, coordinating directly with the civilians on the ground, keeping them calm, keeping them moving, keeping them believing the power would hold because someone had told her it would. Hours blurred together. At some point Thesk returned, not to argue anymore, but to help, running cooling lines beside me without another word about strategy or doctrine. Whatever this was, it had stopped needing an explanation. By the time the last transport lifted off from the surface, carrying the final group of Velkarai civilians to safety, the reactor was barely holding, alarms flashing across every panel, but it was holding. I shut it down myself only after confirmation came through that every ship was clear of the atmosphere, and Ilyara stood beside me as the lights in the maintenance bay finally dimmed, the whole base falling into a strange, exhausted quiet. She did not thank me with grand words. She simply looked at me for a long moment, the way someone looks at a fact they have to rebuild their whole understanding around, and she said that she had spent her entire life learning that everyone eventually leaves, and that lesson had just stopped being true. I told her that was the point. Staying was never about winning or losing the numbers. It was about choosing to be there anyway. Word of what happened on Velkarai spread quickly through the surrounding systems, not as a strategic victory, because by every official measure, nothing had been won, only survived. But it spread anyway, from Thesk's reports, from Claire's careful briefings, from civilians who remembered the power staying on when it was supposed to fail. Other species began asking questions about humanity that they had never needed to ask before. Not about our ships or our weapons, but about this strange, illogical habit we carried with us across the stars. This refusal to run the math before deciding whether someone was worth staying for. Ilyara never asked me to explain it again after that night. She did not need to. She simply stopped expecting me to leave, the same quiet way she had once expected everyone to. And somewhere in that shift, in the space between an old fear and a new kind of trust, something changed on Velkarai that no doctrine, no formula, and no careful, rational withdrawal had ever managed to create. I had not saved the planet. Nobody could have done that. But I had stayed, and for the first time in her life, that was enough to change everything Ilyara believed about the people who came from the stars beyond her own.